Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us today. I have the enormous privilege to introduce today's speaker, Emmy van Deurzen, my personal hero. Emmy is a philosopher, counseling psychologist, existential therapist, and university professor. She's an author of numerous books on existential psychotherapy, and I strongly recommend them. She is the founder of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling and the Existential Academy in London. Emmy, welcome and thank you ever so much for joining us today. I'm going to pass over to you and I will continue just keeping an eye on the questions so that I can share them with you when you finish sharing your slides. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's absolutely a great pleasure to be here because this is such a wonderful series. I'm pleased to be able to contribute something to it. So thanks to all of you who've organized it, including Mick, whose idea I believe it was. So I'm going to share my screen and start on my slides. You should now be able to see those.
That looks great, Emmy. Everything working here.
Very good. So then I shall say a few words about what I'm going to talk about, which is how we as counselors and therapists have learned that we can actually change and be different in a world that has become very polarized and which is potentially quite apocalyptic now, which is not a very nice place to find ourselves. So I don't have to speak about this because Sylvia's done it. I used to be principal, still am principal of the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling, where we run these 5 master's programs and 2 doctoral programs. But from the 1st of August, we'll be standing down from that, passing it on to Claire Arnold-Baker and Danny van Deurzen Smith. And what I will be focusing on then is the Existential Academy. So it's only a semi-retirement. And the Existential Academy is a not-for-profit community interest company where we do just these kinds of things, doing things for the wider public, giving the skills and the knowledge of our profession away to the wider world. Our motto is bringing philosophy to the community. And we also offer other things, like we do some training, existential therapy training, CPD training, but also emotional support for groups when they need it, like the EU citizens in the UK or the Ukrainians in the UK. And we also host organizations that need a home, like the Federation for Existential Therapists in Europe, Voices for Europe, Society of Psychotherapy, the Existential Research Academy, and very importantly, the existential movement. Now, the existential movement is exactly what this today is about. It's about bringing wisdom to the world. It's a group of existential psychotherapists from all around the world who are on our board, who are supporting this project and who are trying to change the world to some extent in terms of the ideas that dominate the world. These are my books. You don't want to hear about that. This book you might be interested in because there are a lot of the ideas in there, which is called Rising from Existential Crisis, Life Beyond Calamity. So if you're interested in reading more about what I say today, that's where it is. But there will also be quite a bit of things from my next book, which I've just finished the second draft of, which is called Art of Freedom, Guide to a Wiser Life, with Penguin. Don't know when that's coming out exactly. So all of this to say that what I'll be speaking about is how I believe that we need an existential turn in the world. And what I mean by that is that we need to get away from our narrow local approaches towards a much broader perspective, have a more philosophical view of what is going wrong, why there are so many people who are troubled. We need really to refresh our understanding of what it means to be a human being, and to be more creative, more dynamic, and more reflective about everything, and to be more engaged in finding meaning and purpose and searching for truth and finding our moral courage and our values. So how do we do that in a world that is so often nonsensical and that drives us, quite frankly, to despair? And how can we help people in a world like that when they find themselves despairing or when they find themselves in a really bad position? Because, you know, when you look at how the world is faring, it's not difficult to see that it's not doing very well. It's pretty dystopic. There is a plethora of catastrophes and calamities wherever you look. You know, Afghanistan, Brexit, COVID, the ABC of our recent troubles, but also the Syria, Middle East wars, the Ukraine war, which is just completely flabbergasted us. The fact that there's so much poverty now, even in the UK, that we're in an energy crisis. And then these even bigger issues, the loss of biodiversity, that's the one that really gets me, and the global climate crisis, and the plutocratic dictatorships in so many places, and the terrible sense that there are more and more young people who are going into a nihilistic direction. The first port of call is, though, to realize that these wars that we see happening around us and the natural disasters we see are hugely impactful on whole regions of the world because they restrict people's freedom so much. When people going through these things, everything shifts and everything changes, and the normal rules simply do not apply to them anymore. Right, somebody has, fine. We need to rise above this kind of thing and understand how we can prevent them. Because when we find ourselves in an existential crisis, it is an overall completely absorbing experience. It is an upheaval that affects every part of your life. And not just does it affect you, but it literally rips apart the fabric of your life. It pulls it apart by the seams, and it unweaves everything that you have so carefully put together. So it feels like total destruction. And you know that you will have to reweave your life. You will have to re-put everything together and find new connections. You'll need to transform everything. And you'll need to find a resilience that you never had before. But of course, it's also a moment where you can rethink why this happened, what your life is about. People almost always start asking the question, why now? Why me? Why is this happening to me? Because otherwise it makes no sense. You try to begin to make new connections of meaning by taking little pieces of the puzzle and fitting them together. And then you begin to get that good feeling of being alive and being able to make sense of things by putting them together and fitting them in their right places. And you can start to do this plaiting again, this weaving together, this braiding of things that are otherwise apart. But it's much easier to do that if you understand how things do fit together. Normally, we kind of sit at our screens and we go through the world imagining that all of our relationships and all of the tasks we do and all of the roles we play and all of that are terribly important and that we have good control. But when something huge happens, it severs all of that and meaning is gone. Now, the first thing that you find that everybody who goes through a complete existential crisis, especially if it is related to a war or some other catastrophe, they discover that the only way to start healing is to rise above it to some extent, to go to a new level from where it can actually make sense. Because when you stay at the broken level, it makes no sense at all, and it is just painful. So this level at which you remind yourself that night still follows day, and a new day will dawn, and a new spring will come, and the universe is still doing what it has always done and will continue to do that. Those are the context in which you can begin to make sense of things. So this is what you do. Essentially, you find a way to climb to a height from where you can look around again instead of being surrounded by pain and misery and fear and difficulty and destruction. You get a sense that mentally and spiritually, you're finding strength in yourself that you didn't know was there before. And when people do find that position, they will find the other people who are similarly in that position, and with them, they can rebuild safety, community, a new sense of identity, and a sense of trust in these greater things rather than the smaller things that have gotten lost. Now, therapists understand these things, but it is quite a lot harder to apply that understanding when we're talking about whole groups in society or in civilization that are experiencing such thing. So it's important to have some kind of map, some kind of orientation about how these things fit together. This is why I like to think of it like this. The individual is there in that little gray ball, often feeling isolated, which of course is never really true, but it feels like that when you're miserable. They have a family around them, they have peer groups around them, they have a society around them and institutions, but they also have a culture around them, which they may rise to find some kind of new help and support from. And ultimately, they're still based in nature. And nature is the great healer of great catastrophes. And when it is a natural disaster, that makes it all the harder, because when floods have destroyed an entire village, it is very difficult for the people in that village to trust nature. So it is hugely important for them to find somewhere safe, physical, in nature, so that they can reestablish that contact. The connection with the cosmos beyond that remains the same. Looking at the stars, looking at the sun, thinking about what is beyond us is always a helpful beginning to that understanding. What often comes out of going through an existential crisis is that we begin to see that it is humanity that has created a lot of the catastrophes that people are dealing with. So it is just a fact that every war is created by human beings and seems so senseless and mindless. But it is also a fact that many natural disasters, especially now, are actually humanly created as well. But it isn't just wars and natural disasters that drive people to distraction. They also, in therapy sessions, and you will all recognize this, they will complain about the unfairness and wrongness about the organizations they belong to, the institutions they're part of, the industries they work in. Their government drives them to distraction and despair, quite frankly, especially when they're obviously poor values and people are selfish and greedy and competitive. But the same can happen in couples and families too, because when people are under terrible pressure, their tempers fray, they're not the best of themselves, and they begin to hate each other and to despair about human beings altogether. It's not just the environment that's messed up. Human existence and human relations are very often destructive and toxic too. So we cannot just work with people in therapy to make them readapt to a society that is unhealthy and in which they don't feel at ease at all. Simone de Beauvoir in The Mandarins said, "You can't lead a proper life in a society which isn't proper. Whichever way you turn, you're always caught because you cannot draw a straight line in a curved space." Think about that, how important it is that as therapists, we take this into account. We ask ourselves what the societal and political dimensions are. And we keep our eyes open to how hard many people have to struggle to learn to live in very unfair and unjust circumstances. It literally is a moral and an ontic struggle for them. And therefore, to apply your usual ethics or any kind of dogma to that situation is never helpful. Because as Sartre said, there is no abstract ethics. People have to work out what the rules are, what the values are in every situation. It is not concrete, it is adaptable and changeable. So we have to face reality. Situation has changed. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s, there was a sense of hope. There was also a sense of fear with the Cold War, and there were some terrible moments. But there was definitely a sense that we as a new generation were going to do things differently and everything was going to get better. You know, the sort of hippie faith in humanity and doing things differently. But things are quite different now. The planet may not be in danger because it's probably a lot tougher than human beings. But human beings are definitely now in a situation where we may not survive another century as a human race. So the climate and the biocrises are really serious. The forests are dying. The decline in biodiversity is a huge problem. The world is literally on fire. Don't take my word for it. Look up the UN Environment Program on that website and you will see it for yourself. To just give you a few ideas, we are using the equivalent of 1.6 Earth at the moment, rather than of 1 Earth. And 1 million of the world's 8 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction. Close to 90% of the world's fish stocks are overexploited and depleted. The global food system is under huge pressure and may not manage. Is it any surprise that people are depressed and anxious? Do you actually realize how bad that situation is? How many people are addicted to antidepressants and other prescribed substances? It's the worst form of substance abuse that is known. So opioids and benzos and hypnotics are almost as bad as antidepressants. But let's stick with antidepressants since they're supposed to help people. So the number of antidepressants prescribed per year has more than tripled over the past 2 decades. So there were 18.4 million in 98 and 70.9 million in 2018. And so there used to be prescriptions of 377 items per 1,000 population, but now there are 1266 per 1,000, which is crazy. These figures are taken from an article in the British Journal for General Practice. The nice figures about the cost of anxiety in the EU is that it is 41 billion euros. This was in 2004. And did you know that there are 60,000 deaths by suicide in the EU alone? Worldwide, it is terrifying. Now, these are very scary figures, very scary realities, and we really need to think about these things in a new way. People are profoundly unhappy, and they think somehow that if they are unhappy, then they are ill and they are a failure and they cannot go on. But actually, of course, this is false. Not to be happy in a world that is in trouble is the right thing to do. And you don't have to make yourself feel happy if things are seriously difficult. And if we go after happiness as a goal, as an objective, we forget often that there are many other things that are just as great values, like love or friendship or meaningful activity or freedom or human development or beauty. So many other things that people could turn to, but they don't. If you've never listened to Robert Waldinger's TED Talk, I strongly urge you to do so, because he speaks about this amazing long-term Harvard study, which has been running for over 80 years, since 1938. And it has followed up in great intensity 2 groups of people. One group were sophomores at Harvard, and the others were from Boston's poorest neighborhoods. And they have continued studying these people and also their children and now some of their grandchildren. They have looked at their health and their mental health, and they have done amazing numbers of data, which they have processed in lots and lots of different ways. And there are just a few things that I want to draw from that. One is that it is meaning in a person's life that makes the difference. If a person has meaning in their life, they live considerably longer and they report themselves as considerably happier. And most often, meaning is created by having these connections that make sense and that fit together. So having good relationships, close relationships, in which we can work things out and trust each other and overcome difficulties together, that makes for a healthier life. The people who end up lonely and isolated do far, far worse. So it's all about quality, not about quantity. You don't have to have loads of friends. You just have to have trusted connectivity, trusted people that you can work out conflicts with, because conflict that isn't resolved wrecks your health and your mental health. Loyalty and a sense of belonging are incredibly good for your mental health. The good life is built with good relationship and a sense of great homes. Now I'd like to take you through some other research projects that have been done about global projections of subjective well-being. I wrote a book in 2009 about the illusion of happiness and the search for happiness and how it is completely paradoxically not what makes people happy. And it was really my answer to positive psychology. In fairness to positive psychologies have listened, have taken these things into account, and they're looking much more at negatives as well as just positives as well now. But this was the global map of well-being that was made in 2006, published by UNESCO. And that was based on simply asking people what their subjective well-being was, SWB as it used to be called. And it was alleged, because it wasn't true, that it was, the well-being was highest, as you can see on this map, in the countries with the darkest red color. So that was the USA, it was Scandinavia, and it was Australia, basically. Ireland as well, as you can see, but not actually England. So very interesting, but it obviously was very much related to affluence and prosperity, and that couldn't be right. So another group of people came up with the Happy Planet Index, which challenged this view. And so they had a different formula for understanding how people can be made more happy. So they figured out how people's subjective well-being, they called it experienced well-being, was, how high it was. And they multiplied it by the life expectancy in an area and then divided it by the ecological footprint of that area. And that came up with a very different result. So it reversed essentially the vision of how happy the world is. And you can see now the colors are a bit different. So the reds are now poor and orange a little less poor, and yellow is medium, and green is good. So you see that some of the countries that were working very hard at living, at their nations living better lives and having more sustainable industries and things like that, started to show up as coming out much better. This 2016 map, which is done in this much more sort of realistic way, very interesting way of doing it, shows the same thing again with the same sort of areas coming out very high. So the wealthy societies are not doing well at all anymore by this measure, because of course they use up far too much energy, for starters. And places like Costa Rica, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Mexico, because they are improving sustainability and equality, come out top. It is a fascinating bit of research. So you can see that the sense of what's happening globally in the world is shifting and changing. Instead of thinking richness is going to be leading to people being most happy and those countries being able to lord it over other countries, there is a movement of how politicians change their countries. So instead of coming to this clash of civilizations as per Huntington or Fukuyama, or as Camus discussed in his book, The Last Man, which is a very interesting book, by the way, is that actually by migration and exchanges between peoples, we figure out what values are actually globally accepted by all people and globally recognized as necessary for the future of a safe planet. And then we come up with values that we all recognize, such as love and decency and cooperation and justice. And every single human being, wherever on the earth, recognizes this, no matter what their culture, no matter what their religion. There is complete unanimity about that. And it is very important to use that as our starting point. It is a lot more like Hans Köchler's transcultural understanding, which is an important thing we have to come to. And we do that through dialoguing with each other. Psychotherapists know exactly how to do this. And therefore, that therapeutic knowledge is going to become essential for the future of the world. And also Amartya Sen's work on development as freedom. You may also find it interesting to have a look at the regional well-being of different areas in the world. Go to the website of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, who used 12 dimensions to figure out where each region is tracking, and you might have some surprises when you look at that. There is a lot of knowledge about all of this, and actually, when you read around it, global human well-being would, in principle, be relatively easy to achieve because we know how it works. But of course, in practice, there are a lot of vested interests that stand in the way of this. So this is how you do it. This is how you create a better society and a global world that will do well on its planet. 1, you create a healthy planet. You stimulate biodiversity, you plant more forests, you clean up your air and your water. We know how to do these things, we're just not doing it. Non-proliferation of fossil fuels, it's just 100 companies that do all the polluting. Global renewable energy, and we know there's so much technology about that now. We know how to do that too. Creating safe public transport and cycle lanes. Thirdly, establish small-scale ecological communities, a bit like Findhorn in Scotland, which we can talk about, where people grow their own food and have communal orchards, allotments, communal healthcare, education, and everything is equal for all concerned. Establish a global secular morality with these basic global principles that we can all agree on, and make those the basis of all interaction. So that is fairness, equality, diversity, respect, freedom, dignity, truth, love, and freedom. People are still free to practice whatever religion they want on top of that, but religions are not allowed to get into the overall decision-making. Eliminate extreme wealth by tax, eliminate extreme poverty by minimum income for all. There are two things that are demonstrably possible and would eliminate poverty straight away. Global disarmament and the establishment of a dialectical, therapeutic way of approaching the difficulties in the world. And one way that works extremely well is the movement of citizens' assemblies, where people are given information about something and then are facilitated in having discussions about how to solve problems. These guidelines would work very well. But it isn't like that at all. And when you work in your practice or in a hospital with any human being, you will find them upset about many philosophical inequalities. They will maybe not be aware of it, but they will be angry that it seems that the world is not a fair place, that people are getting exploited instead of having equal opportunities, that people profiteer and put productivity always over creativity, that there is global consumption in such a way that nobody is aware anymore of the value of each of us contributing, giving rather than taking, and being generous with each other. Achievements over the long term need to be taken into account, but usually short-term results are favored over long-term consequences. Freedoms are asked for, but responsibilities are not taken by many people. People want the rights rather than duties or obligations. They have learned that the world is a place where you have to compete rather than collaborate, and that leads to no end of trouble. People want instant gain rather than thinking about what the longer-term values are. They want fame and fortune, and as I said, happiness, rather than learning to live well and do right by themselves and each other. They want excitement and youthful experimentation, which is great, but we also need some mature reflection and understanding. So the point is that we need to put our work in this bigger picture and see how people are trapped in these loops. And we need to enable people to reclaim their own capacity for creating a better way of living. They will not be able to change governments, but they will be able to make significant changes at the local level, as we saw, for instance, during the pandemic, where people learned to look out for the most vulnerable, and there were amazing local projects of people supporting each other. But it is also about bringing back the habit of asking bigger questions. What does it mean to be alive? Why is there something rather than nothing? How should I act as a human being? How should I be in relation to others? How can I live a life that is worthwhile and doesn't lead to me wanting to kill myself? And also, what might happen to me after death? Most people don't get to that. What they do instead is making things smaller. They hide away. They take their meds. They take their alcohol. They take their television. They take their pleasures in order to keep their lives small and to hide in small pockets of protective sheltering. This is not a moral bad thing. It is just a logical thing that happens to people when they feel the world is not a safe place. So enabling people to find their inner authority again and to find a way to be courageous enough to make a difference, take some risks, do something new, believe in something again. As Rollo May said, if human beings are living in a condition of emptiness, they don't just stagnate, they despair, and eventually it leads to destruction or self-destruction. So we need to restore meaning, right? We need to restore meaning in lots of different ways. We need to find sanctuary. I'm going to have to go through these slides a little bit because I know I should be stopping in about 5 minutes. And there's a few things I want to say still. So we know as therapists that we need to go step by step with these things, but we need to take life as our guide. What is this person's world? What connections can they make? What values can they evolve and develop? What are the life issues they're preoccupied with? What are the paths they're on? Where have they come from? Where are they going? What understanding can they have? How can they figure this out better? How can they get more power back in their own hands? How can they find new direction and purpose and overcome the blockages and the difficulties? How can they find strength and grow in facing those challenges? And you know, when they do, their brains follow suit. This is such a wonderful thing. We know now that the neurons do not just make loads more connections with every bit of learning we do, but they also actually create new neurons to store new learning. And so as people learn and as they figure out how things fit together and where they fit in and what their talents are and what they can contribute to the world instead of despairing over the world, then they can create new meanings, refresh past meanings, but see what meanings there are now and in the future and what meanings there may be eternally. Spinoza, one of my favorite philosophers, said that we should learn to think about life sub specie eternitatis, from a perspective of eternity. And that is very true. If we go circling from past to present, and then from present to future, and back to the present and back to the past, eventually it also needs to be put in perspective with that figure 8 of eternity, so that we get a broader view than just what has gone wrong yesterday and what is not going well tomorrow. We use our emotions. We understand that paradoxes are not something to fight with. They are something to open up to work with in a dialectical way. I have my view from the past. You have your view in the present. Together, in dialogue, we create a wider view for the future. And we find a way to transcend and weave these strands together. And so we know how to do that, but we also need to bring this knowledge to the community so that there can be hope for people instead of antidepressants, and there can be a sense that love is actually possible. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote this wonderful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is essentially about the American Indian wisdom that has been lost. And she says, if all the world is a commodity and we use each other and we use things, how poor we grow. When all the world is a gift in motion, how wealthy we become. So let's find back our forward movement and the joy of knowing that each of us has a gift we can contribute to a world that can work in a direction of remembering what we have forgotten and recreating some of the things we have lost. Tuning into the universe will help us in doing so. Loving our life is a wonderful thing when we have a sense of an overview of all the different small ways in which we can fit things back into the right places and use our energy to build something. So physically, create harmony, use your skills, use the facts that you know, and act for the better. Tune into the cosmos, the planet, the natural world. Create safe places, safe housing, meaningful products in your garden, good healthcare, socially affiliate, give, contribute to the world, create good institutions, good truth-based ways of making decisions collaboratively and in community. Use your inner integrity to intervene in the world. Don't be afraid to speak up. We need every person who has gone through these struggles to stand up and be counted and to contribute with their creativity, their thought, their arts, their music, their leisure, everything they can contribute, and to transcend what has happened to our planet, to our world, and create a new vision and a new framework together. New possibilities will emerge if we do this patiently, because a self, a couple, and a society are not things. They are a matrix for meanings and for values to manifest dynamically. They unfold slowly. We can change these things, and we must change these things. So please don't be shy. Do these things, learn, and thank you for being here today to think about that together and for making it happening together. Questions, discussion? I'd love to hear of any projects you know of where this is happening.
Thank you so much, Amy. Wonderful and so inspiring and so rich. And we'll share the slides with everybody, so please don't worry. You can read through them. We had a few questions on chat, and I know somebody has raised hands. So I'll just sum up very quickly what came up in chat. We had a response to your conversation around well-being up north and in the global majority. Angela was saying, are people's expectations too high in the first world societies? Maybe the window of tolerance is different, and sadness and happiness do not mean mental health issues, like you said later, actually. Mm-hmm. And I think there was also an interesting question around, or maybe pondering around how leadership maybe should consider all the points you were taking on instead of focusing on economics and power. And also we had a note around class that kind of ties into leadership as well, that some people might be consuming more than others. But I know that we only have 5 minutes and we like to pass over to our participants. So I'm going to ask Omar to just unmute himself and ask the question.
Hiya, Emmy, and
Hi,
hi everybody. Yeah, I wrote quite a few things down actually in your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Something what sticks out for me, and I'm interested in, is narcissism. And I think we've got a world full of narcissism, and there's something what I've looked at is Heinz Kohut's idea of destructive narcissism and healthy narcissism. And I'm just wondering, with your ideas, how do we move people into healthy narcissism? I asked Richard Erskine this question with transactional analysis, and I think with healthy narcissism, we create a better world where people are confident, they believe in themselves, but then they don't actually exploit people. What's destructive? I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Yes, it makes great sense to me. But I think this obsession with narcissism is very misleading, because when you work with the people that other people call narcissistic, you will discover that what they actually are, these people, are very empty people. They're people who are lost to themselves, far from them being people who are highly confident. They are people who are so empty that they have to push into the world to try and get something from the world that they haven't got inside of them. And I think this is what you mean by healthy narcissism. When a person is able to have a healthy relationship with themselves, and they love themselves and they care for themselves, then they will also be able to take that into the world and share it out. There'll be an overflow of that. But when that isn't happening, then they're actually very unloving with themselves. And from that very unloving position, they'll do so much out there in the world that is damaging or that is demanding, but that isn't actually helping them any more than other people. So those are just very poor ways of operating as a human being. And what is so sad is that a lot of the people who are poor in their humanity rise to the top because they learn to manipulate objects and money and other people and to organize things in certain ways rather than to listen to what is really going on for them inside of them and around them, witnessing other people's pain or other people's need. None of that is happening anymore, which is exactly what we're doing to the natural world. You know, we're eroding it and we're depleting it. Well, these people who are narcissists, I don't think they are narcissists, they're empty people. They are the people who have far too much power a lot of the time. So everything is topsy-turvy. And we need to address that. We absolutely must address that. You might be interested to know that I have spoken about these things twice now in the Lib Dem conference, in their Green Party in the Lib Dems, and once at the Labour conference as well. So there are people in political parties who are interested in what can come from this human understanding and who are aware that people, you know, philosophers, psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, those people should be listened to, and they should be working with human beings to put that at the top of the agenda rather than as something we only do when people are mentally ill. No. Society is in dire straits, and we need to think about these things anew. And we know what's going on. We understand what's going on. And what's more, we know how to fix it. But it will be a very long fix.
Sorry to interrupt you, one more thing, because you mentioned politics. And I mentioned this before. There's a thread of Machiavellianism in politics. And I'm just wondering about political philosophy, if that can change. There's too much Machiavellianism in politics. There's too much deceitfulness. And things need to change. Things need to change there.
Things will change, though, because what these Machiavellian characters don't quite face is the fact that we're going to go from one crisis to the next over the next decades, and that everything is going to get very different. And there'll be panic, and there'll be people reaching out for those who actually have a clue as to what needs to be done. And there are many people who are ready to do that and step in, not just us understanding about the relationships and the ways of being involved in that, but also, you know, fantastic ecologists, fantastic people in economy who understand that things need to go completely differently. There are many people getting ready for this big crisis, which will happen.
And I agree with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for asking your question as well. And I'm aware of the time. I'm so grateful, Emmy, that you were able to at least answer one question for us. It's brilliant. You're welcome to stay. We'll, as mentioned earlier, we'll be moving into the network meeting.
Okay.
Sometimes we continue talking about those presentations. Sometimes we just check in to make sure that the community questions are answered as well. But we're so grateful. There was a lot of feedback around how inspirational you are and how wonderful. Somebody even said, "We love you, Emmy," with a big smiley on the chat. So thank you so much for everything today. So grateful to have you.
Thank you for saying that. That's really lovely. Thank you.